They called it the happiest day of her life. She called it the day she disappeared. The air smelled of roses, white roses, specifically chosen by his mother to symbolize purity and grace, though none of those words had ever been used to describe Isabel Laurent. The cathedral was grand, almost menacing, with its marble columns and cold gold accents that whispered of wealth and restraint. Everything looked perfect, and yet it felt like the prelude to a funeral she hadn't realized was hers. She stood before the mirror in the bridal chamber, the silk of her gown clinging to her skin like a second layer of expectations. Her reflection stared back at her, unrecognizable not for the makeup or the intricate updo, but because the girl she once was had vanished long before the veil covered her face. Isabel, at 27, was not the girl who used to dream about love. She was now a woman walking into a storm willingly, because everyone told her the sun was shining. There was no father walking her down the aisle. He had passed years ago. Her mother had remarried and sent regrets via text. Her friends, well, most of them had drifted once she entered the Laurent estate, a family known for their legacy in pharmaceuticals and cruelty disguised as elegance. She had no bridesmaids, only observers, but none of that mattered, she reminded herself, because she was marrying Julian Laurent, the youngest heir to the Laurent dynasty, was the kind of man who looked like a promise wrapped in a tailored suit. Tall, sharp-jawed, disarmingly polite when cameras were near. He courted her like a gentleman, proposed under the stars in Santorini, and kissed her hand as if it were made of porcelain. But love, she would learn, could be performed without ever being real. As the doors opened and the organ played, Isabel took her first step down the aisle. Every eye turned toward her, not out of admiration, but to inspect, to judge, to measure whether she was worthy of the name they were about to let her borrow. And in that moment, she felt it, the small death in her chest, the one where dreams go to sleep. Julian didn't smile. He nodded, formal, cold, distant, like a man signing a contract he didn't write. When the vows came, she spoke softly, trembling. His voice, on the other hand, rang steady and scripted. I promise to honor and protect you. But the silence that followed that sentence whispered, until it no longer serves me. The reception was lavish. Chandeliers of crystal hung like frozen tears. The menu had 5 courses, none of which she had the appetite to eat. Strangers toasted to her good fortune while muttering jokes about how long she'd last. The Laurent women, Julian's sisters and mother, hovered with perfectly arched brows and venom-laced smiles. You've done well, dear, his mother said, glass of champagne in hand. Just remember, no woman ever truly belongs here unless she earns it. Isabel nodded, smiled, swallowed the insult whole. She knew that this wasn't a union, it was an arrangement. She was the ornament they had chosen to polish, parade, and discard when scratched. Later that night, when the guests had left and the candlelight grew soft and flickering, she stood on the balcony of the penthouse suite, looking down at the city that sparkled like it held answers. Inside, Julian poured whiskey, took off his jacket, loosened his tie, not once looking at her. You're quiet, he said finally. I'm just tired, she replied. He smirked, glass in hand. Get used to it. That was their wedding night. No tenderness, no affection, just a statement of terms. That was the night Isabel began to vanish, one piece at a time. Her laugh, once bright, dulled into echoes. Her opinions, once sharp, dissolved into silence. Her world shrank to match the walls of their estate. And every time she looked in the mirror, she saw less of herself and more of the woman they wanted her to be. Voiceless, poised, controlled. But what none of them knew, what not even Julian suspected, was that something inside her did not die. It waited. It watched. And someday, it would rise. She married into a palace. But they didn't know she was already building her empire beneath the floorboards. Some houses have ghosts. Hers had expectations that were far more terrifying. And none of the mirrors could ever show her face because they were never meant to. The Laurent estate, seated on a secluded hillside above Geneva's Sapphire Lake, was less a home and more a museum curated by generations of pride and cruelty. Its corridors were wide but cold, adorned with oil portraits of long-dead men who stared down from gilded frames with narrowed eyes and clenched jaws, as if silently judging the living who dared to breathe beneath their legacy. From the moment Isabel moved in, she realized something peculiar. The mirrors in the estate were either too high, too narrow, or placed in such a way that they reflected everything but her. In the grand halls, She could see chandeliers, velvet chairs, and distant doors, but not her own silhouette. In the powder room, the mirror stopped just below her collarbone. And in the master bedroom, the largest mirror stood directly behind. The bed's headboard completely useless, deliberately so. She asked once, "Why are there no proper mirrors here?" She had inquired softly to Julian's mother during an afternoon tea where the silence was more bitter than the Earl Grey. Lady Margot Laurent did not lift her gaze from the delicate saucer in her lap. "Darling, mirrors can be distracting. It's best not to focus too much on oneself. Vanity is unbecoming in a Laurent wife." It wasn't about vanity. It was about erasure, and slowly it worked. Each morning, Isabel woke in silence. Julian was usually gone before dawn, off to the city, to the boardroom, to a mistress, perhaps leaving no trace but the scent of cedar cologne and apathy. Meals were served at exact hours. Speaking was discouraged unless spoken to. Her opinions, even on trivial things like which flowers to arrange in the drawing room, were often dismissed with a cold smile and a colder correction. "You'll learn to trust tradition," his older sister Colette once said while pouring wine. "The less you assert, the longer you survive." The staff addressed her as Madame Laurent, but never with warmth. They had seen women like her come and go, bright-eyed wives who thought love could soften dynasty, only to be devoured by it. One afternoon, Isabel found herself in the library, one of the few rooms not constantly monitored. She sat before the fireplace with a worn copy of Jane Eyre in her hands, the irony not lost on her. As she turned the pages, she realized that the character she once admired, the woman who spoke with fire and pride, now seemed like a stranger. A version of herself she could barely remember. That evening, Julian returned. "You've been quiet lately," he said, pouring himself a drink, never offering one to her. She looked at him across the vast living room. "I've had nothing to say," he chuckled, a sound void of humor. "Good, that's how it should be." The days blurred. Colette began suggesting fertility treatments. Margot gifted her books with passive-aggressive titles like The Obedient Wife and Legacy Through Maternity. Even the family doctor on their payroll hinted at the window of usefulness closing if she didn't conceive soon. Isabel smiled. Through it all, she folded linens. She attended family dinners. She played the piano when asked. And inside, she died 1,000 small deaths. But her silence wasn't surrender. It was survival. One night, she stood before the hallway's antique window pane, the only surface that vaguely showed her reflection. Her outline looked blurred, distant, fading. That's when she whispered to the glass, "They took away every mirror so I'd forget who I was. But I haven't, not entirely, not yet." And in the stillness of that thought, a seed was planted. She wouldn't be erased forever. She would rise, and when she did, they'd need more than gold-framed portraits to protect themselves. In a house without mirrors, she began building one in her mind, one made not of glass, but of memory, fury, and the woman she used to be. They didn't just silence her, they carved her silence into the walls of their legacy. But pain has a way of cracking even the thickest marble. It began, as most betrayals do, with something small, something meant to be hidden, insignificant, overlooked. A locked drawer left ajar, a lipstick stain on a collar she never wore, a folded letter in handwriting that wasn't hers. And yet, Isabel had trained herself to see the invisible, to read the empty spaces between words, between gestures, between lies. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled like distant judgment over the Laurent estate, Isabel found herself alone in Julian's study. He had forbidden her entry before, always citing important contracts or sensitive negotiations. But today, the door was unlocked, open, waiting. Curiosity was not what drove her in. Survival was. She moved like someone breaking into a memory, careful not to disturb the dust, aware that truth might cost her everything. The first thing she noticed was the cabinet, small, mahogany, oddly ornate for a room so cold. Its drawer, slightly ajar, revealed a thin stack of papers. Legal documents. At first, they seemed like ordinary transactions. Then her eyes caught a name, Isabel Laurent. Annulment petition. Drafted, not yet filed. Her breath left her body, like someone had punched her from the inside. There were signatures. His mother's, even the family's lawyer, but not hers. The date? 3 months ago, before their first anniversary, before their first kiss that almost felt real, before she stopped believing that maybe he would grow to love her. Her knees buckled, but she did not fall. Instead, She sat slowly in Julian's leather chair, the documents trembling in her hands. It wasn't just rejection. It was premeditated disposal. An expiration date carved onto her soul. She scanned further and found more conversations about asset divisions, frozen accounts, NDAs, and a note scribbled at the bottom of one page in Julian's sharp, heartless pen. Make sure she signs before we announce the merger. A merger? Her name wasn't the only pawn. She was part of a strategic business alliance. A wife. Yes, but also a tool, a trade, a thread in a fabric woven without her consent. That night, Isabel said nothing. She dined with the family as always, ate the bitter greens and sipped the soulless wine, smiled politely as Julian recounted his trip to Milan, nodded as Margot spoke of her philanthropy, listened as Colette mocked another woman for wearing last season's desperation. They didn't notice the firestorm behind Isabel's eyes, because they never truly looked at her. When Julian returned to the study after midnight, the drawer had been ray-locked, the papers untouched, or so he thought. Isabel lay in bed with her back to him, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. He reached for her waist out of habit, one more performance in their quiet opera of nothingness, but she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She had become stone. But inside, the cracks had opened and something ancient, something primal, something powerful was waking. Betrayal didn't kill her. It rewired her. She was no longer a woman looking for love. She was a storm preparing to remember her name. They didn't just silence her. They carved her silence into the walls of their legacy. But pain has a way of cracking even the thickest marble. It began, as most betrayals do, with something small, something meant to be hidden, insignificant, overlooked. A locked drawer left ajar, a lipstick stain on a collar she never wore, a folded letter in handwriting that wasn't hers. And yet, Isabel had trained herself to see the invisible, to read the empty spaces between words, between gestures, between lies. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled like distant judgment over the Laurent estate, Isabel found herself alone in Julian's study. He had forbidden her entry before, always citing important contracts or sensitive negotiations. But today, the door was unlocked, open, waiting. Curiosity was not what drove her in. Survival was. She moved like someone breaking into a memory, careful not to disturb the dust, aware that truth might cost her everything. The first thing she noticed was the cabinet, small, mahogany, oddly ornate for a room so cold. Its drawer, slightly ajar, revealed a thin stack of papers, legal documents. At first, they seemed like ordinary transactions. Then her eyes caught a name, Isabel Laurent. Annulment petition. Drafted, not yet filed. Her breath left her body, like someone had punched her from the inside. There were signatures. His mother's, even the family's lawyer, but not hers. The date? 3 months ago, before their first anniversary, before their first kiss that almost felt real, before she stopped believing that maybe he would grow to love her. Her knees buckled, but she did not fall. Instead, she sat slowly in Julian's leather chair, the documents trembling in her hands. It wasn't just rejection. It was premeditated disposal. An expiration date carved onto her soul. She scanned further and found more conversations about asset divisions, frozen accounts, NDAs, and a note scribbled at the bottom of one page in Julian's sharp, heartless pen. Make sure she signs before we announce the merger. A merger? Her name wasn't the only pawn. She was part of a strategic business alliance. A wife. Yes, but also a tool, a trade, a thread in a fabric woven without her consent. That night, Isabel said nothing. She dined with the family as always, ate the bitter greens and sipped the soulless wine, smiled politely as Julian recounted his trip to Milan, nodded as Margot spoke of her philanthropy, listened as Colette mocked another woman for wearing last season's desperation. They didn't notice the firestorm behind Isabel's eyes, because they never truly looked at her. When Julian returned to the study after midnight, the drawer had been ray-locked, the papers untouched, or so he thought. Isabel lay in bed with her back to him, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. He reached for her waist out of habit, one more performance in their quiet opera of nothingness, but she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She had become stone. But inside, the cracks had opened and something ancient, something primal, something powerful was waking. Betrayal didn't kill her. It rewired her. She was no longer a woman looking for love. She was a storm preparing to remember her name. They thought they silenced her. But silence is not the absence of voice, it's the sharpest place where rage begins to bloom. And when a woman has nothing left to lose, she begins to listen to herself. The morning after discovering the annulment papers, Isabel moved like porcelain, elegant, unreadable, deliberate. She poured tea for Julian without trembling, kissed his cheek with lips that now knew the taste of ashes, and watched as he left with a careless grin, believing she remained oblivious, obedient, unchanged. But inside, the silence had begun to shift. Like tectonic plates beneath a calm sea, the first place she returned to was the greenhouse long abandoned by the Laurent family after Margot declared it too untamed for proper guests. The glass walls were streaked with dust and rain stains, the earth cracked and dry. Yet in the corner, buried beneath fallen vines and shattered pots, were roots, still breathing, still alive. Like her, she rolled up her sleeves and began digging not just into the soil, but into herself. She cleaned the windows until sunlight returned. She watered with care, as if healing the space could heal the part of her that had been left for dead. And in that greenhouse, no one interrupted her. No one watched. No one controlled. It became her sanctuary, her planning room. She started writing again. In a hidden journal, tucked inside a forgotten book in the library, she began recording everything: the annulment plans, the names on the legal drafts, the accounts frozen without her knowledge, the woman she suspected Julian was seeing. But she also wrote down who she used to be, what she loved, what she feared, what she had buried to become Mrs. Laurent. It was her resurrection map. Her second step was subtle. She began observing the staff, noticing who looked away when she entered, and who dared to glance twice, who whispered in corners, who had once smiled but now looked hollowed. It was the housemaid Celeste who became the first crack in the Laurent fortress. Celeste was young, sharp-eyed, and too quiet to be just another servant. Isabel began leaving books for her coded ones, about rebellion, about strategy, about women who used their minds when their mouths were gagged. One day, Celeste left a note in return, hidden inside a tea towel. "You are not crazy. They do this to every woman." But none of them stayed. That was the beginning of a new alliance, not spoken, but real. Margot began to notice a shift. "You've been spending a lot of time in that greenhouse," she said one afternoon, her words sweet as poison. Isabel smiled gently. "Growing things. It's calming." Margot's lips tightened. "We don't need wild things here, Isabel. Don't forget who you married into." "I haven't," Isabel answered softly. "But sometimes, it's the wild things that survive the winter." Each evening, Isabel sat in front of the window that showed her a sliver of herself. Her reflection had returned, not fully, not clearly, but enough for her to remember the shape of her eyes, the quiet fury in them. She no longer waited for Julian to come home. She no longer tried to make the dinners perfect. She no longer cared to be their perfect doll. She was planning her escape one route at a time. Even a voiceless woman can scream with her silence, her choices, her gaze. And when the time comes, they will not know what hit them, because they never thought she could hit back. No one watched the garden. No one suspected it would listen. But buried things bloom in silence. And Isabel had begun planting more than flowers. By now, the greenhouse was no longer just a retreat. It was a sanctuary of strategy. Each terracotta pot held more than soil. Some had copies of documents she smuggled from Julian's study. Others, slips of parchment scribbled with names and numbers. Every flowerbed carried a coded system. Yellow roses near the north wall for accounts overseas. Lavender by the fountain for her allies. And in the center, a rose bush with no flowers, only thorns. That one was for Margot. It started with the gardener. Henry had worked for the Laurents for 27 years. His hearing had gone soft, his hands knotted with age, but his memory sharp as the shears he kept polished every morning. Isabel approached him slowly. She asked questions about plants at first: which days they bloomed, what bugs ate which roots. Then, over a week of shared tea under the fig tree, she asked about people, and he answered. The shipments Margot sent twice a year, gifts to charities that somehow came back in luxury goods, the cousin who'd been paid to disappear after an inheritance dispute, the previous gardener, a woman, fired when she learned too much. Isabel asked no more. But from then on, Henry left her coded notes in seed packets. The past of the Laurents was being unearthed, petal by petal. Julian remained blind to the shift. He'd begun sleeping away more often, under the guise of business trips. Isabel stopped asking. She stopped pretending to care. She even stopped wearing the necklace he gave her on their wedding day, the one with the family crest. She buried it beneath the rosebush, a funeral of symbols. But what the garden knew was more than just secrets. It became her mirror. She saw herself in the wildness of it, the chaos slowly blooming into something designed. She saw how the vines wrapped around the frame, reclaiming the structure, not to destroy it but to reshape it. One morning, she caught her reflection in the glass, hair wild, cheeks flushed, hands stained with earth. For the first time, she didn't look like a Laurent wife, she looked like a woman who had returned from the grave. Les continued feeding her whispers, each word a match, each sentence a spark. Isabel learned about the shell companies Julian created to hide debt, the affair he funded through family money, the board members Margot blackmailed. Isabel didn't scream. She recorded, she stored, she waited, because if they buried her like compost, they'd underestimated what compost becomes. The first strike was silent, a letter, sent anonymously to an investigative journalist. A single page with a list of transaction IDs, dates, names. She didn't need to sign it. The truth carried its own signature. A woman with a garden does not need a sword. She needs only time and roots, and the right moment to bloom. The most dangerous thing you can give a silenced woman is a piece of her past. Because once she remembers who she was, she no longer accepts who they made her become. And sometimes the mirror doesn't just reflect, it cuts. It arrived in the mail. No return address. No handwriting, just a plain envelope, cream-colored, sealed with wax. Isabel found it resting atop the silver tray in the hallway, nestled between designer catalogs and political invitations. The kind of letter meant to be overlooked. She took it to the garden, under the shade of the olive tree. She broke the seal. Inside, a single photograph, a young woman, 19, smiling in the sunlight, her arms wrapped around an older gentleman in a linen suit. The sea behind them sparkled like applause. And on the back, one line written in ink that trembled with age: "They buried your truth to protect their lies." Isabel's breath caught. The girl was her, but the man beside her, her real father. She had been told he died in an accident, told that her mother remarried quickly to secure their future, told that Julian's family had rescued them from poverty. But the man in the photo, alive, smiling, holding her like she was the whole world, was not a ghost. He was truth. And truth had a way of setting fire to the pretty lies the Laurents built their empire on. That night, she searched her mother's belongings, hidden away in the attic of the West Wing: letters, legal documents, court settlements, everything carefully dated. Everything quietly paid off. A custody battle, silenced witnesses, Margot Laurent's signature on every check. They hadn't rescued Isabel, they had stolen her. Her mother died in grief, her father disappeared from history, and the marriage to Julian, arranged to keep the secret buried for good. She returned to the greenhouse as dawn painted the horizon. She placed the photo in the center of her work table, surrounded it with white roses, lit a single candle. No tears, only the soft burn of resolve. They didn't just betray her marriage, they rewrote her story. And now, she would rewrite theirs. Julian noticed the shift before Margot did. Isabel no longer avoided his gaze. Tea breakfast. She asked about meetings he never told her about. At dinners, she complimented Colette's dresses with an edge that sliced beneath the silk. And when Margot brought up family honor, Isabel simply smiled and said, "Honor isn't inherited, it's earned." Behind the scenes, the mirror began to shatter. She leaked one file, just one, to a financial watchdog, an internal audit Margot had buried 10 years ago that revealed illegal fund transfers. Then another, a recorded phone call where Julian discussed blackmailing a supplier into submission. One by one, cracks appeared, not loud, but irreversible. And through it all, Isabel remained composed, elegant, unshaken. Because when you hold the truth, you don't need to shout, you just wait for the silence to collapse. The mirror they gave her no longer reflects, it refracts. And now, every shard was hers to aim. They erased her name from every ledger, every speech, every family toast. They called her the wife, the girl, that quiet one. But now the halls whispered it again, soft at first, then louder. Isabel. The Laurent estate had always been a fortress: tall windows, long corridors, white walls, too pristine to feel like home. It wasn't built for love, it was built to display power, to silence echoes, to erase anyone who didn't fit the picture-perfect mold Margot painted for the world. For years, Isabel walked those halls like a ghost, smiling when spoken to, nodding when dismissed, folding herself smaller with every passing year until she barely cast a shadow on the parquet floors. But not anymore. It began when she changed the staff. And a one noticed. At first, one maid replaced, a chef relocated, a driver dismissed, but over a month, the household changed its shape. Gone were Margot's loyal eyes and ears. In their place, quiet women with firm gazes, men who nodded only at Isabel's word. She never explained herself. She didn't need to. She was no longer waiting for permission. She was building command. Margot sensed it. She noticed the slight delay when she gave instructions and the hesitation in the butler's eyes before obeying. One afternoon, during tea in the atrium, she leaned in and whispered, "I'm not sure what you think you're doing, Isabel, but this house doesn't belong to you." Isabel stirred her tea slowly, set the spoon down with delicate precision. "You're right," she said softly. "It didn't." A pause. "But it does now." The boardroom followed. A Tia Laurent Foundation Gala. Isabel stepped into the spotlight not as someone's wife or accessory, but as keynote speaker. She wore black velvet and emerald earrings that once belonged to Margot, worn now not out of deference, but reclamation. Her speech did not name names. It didn't need to. She spoke of legacy, of power passed like heirlooms, of women erased and rewritten, and of taking back your name, even if it was buried beneath decades of dust and deceit. The room fell silent after. Then rose an ovation, not for Julian, not for Margot, for her. Julian, watching from the wings, finally saw it, the shift. The weight of the house had moved. Once upon a time, they laughed at her, dismissed her silence as submission, mistook her kindness for weakness. But now, every step she took echoed louder than the last, because a house may forget your name, but the foundations always remember who bled for them. You cannot erase a woman who remembers everything, especially when she learns to sign her own legacy, not in ink, but in stone. Some women raise their voice to be heard. Others raise their empire so high, you have no choice but to listen. And when the chandelier flickers, beware, because the light is about to reveal every hidden sin. The invitations were crafted on black vellum, sealed with a gold crest no one had seen before. A phoenix, wings unfurled, rising from fire. The crest of a name long buried. Isabel d'Orsay, not Laurent, not wife, not property, but origin. The gala was dubbed the Night of Renewal. Charity, they said, art, restoration. But those who had wronged her would remember it as something else entirely. The night Isabel burned down the house that tried to bury her, the Laurent estate had never looked more splendid. Thousands of roses, white, gold, and red lined the staircase. The grand chandelier above the ballroom sparkled with new crystals. Musicians played a haunting string arrangement of Debussy's Clair de Lune. Guests arrived in masks, politicians, moguls, family friends. Enemies dressed in velvet and silk. Julian arrived late. Margot arrived colder. And Isabel? She descended the stairs in a midnight blue gown embroidered with flames, her face bare, her hair crowned with obsidian pins. She did not need a mask, because those who hide are the ones still afraid. She greeted every guest with a knowing smile, kissed hands, accepted praise, ignored the tension in Julian's jaw and the frost in Margot's tone. A game of grace. But her eyes missed nothing. She saw the twitch in her cousin's hand as he lied about investments, heard the tremble in the gallery director's voice as he complimented the stolen painting she'd had quietly returned to its rightful owner last week. And she saw fear, real fear, the kind that bloomed when those who had once dismissed her realized she now held the strings. Midway through the evening, she took the stage, not to toast, but to expose. One by one, files were projected on a grand screen, forged contracts, bribery emails, sealed legal threats, every piece of truth meticulously collected. She did not name names. The documents did that for her. People gasped, whispers turned into panic. Julian stood frozen. Margot tried to speak, but no words came. And Isabel? She looked serene, like a woman watching rot finally meet air. Power built on lies, she said calmly, is not power. It is a ticking clock. And tonight, the chimes had rung. One guest fainted, another left in a flurry of shame. But Isabel remained, a statue of poise amidst chaos. Because she hadn't destroyed them, she had simply turned the light on, and let their own sins do the rest. As the ballroom emptied, Isabel walked through the silent halls, not victorious, not angry, but free. She stood before the mirror and The hallway, the one where, years ago, Margot told her she wasn't fit for the family. Now, she looked into her own reflection and whispered, I was never meant to fit. I was meant to replace it. The reckoning came, not with war, but with truth. Not in revenge, but in revelation. And the queen did not raise her voice, she raised the world's silence instead. They gave her a name that wasn't hers, stripped her of a history, a voice, a throne. But in the end, the world remembered her not as a wife, not as a scandal, but as a name that would outlive them all. A month had passed since the gala, and Europe had not stopped whispering her name. Magazines called it the fall of the Laurent dynasty, but those who knew better called it something else, the rise of Isabelle d'Orsay. The Laurent assets were frozen. Julian had fled to Zurich, his passport revoked days later. Margot was last seen entering a discreet private clinic for exhaustion. The house on the hill, once a symbol of grandeur, now sat silent, like a mausoleum of pride. But Isabelle did not return to it. She had no interest in ruins. She was building something new, her new foundation. Les Reedy res oubli, yes, the forgotten heiresses opened its doors with a clear mission. To give back voices to the women erased. To restore what history stole. To protect the young girls whose futures were written over before they had a chance to choose. At the inauguration, press flooded the grand steps of the converted abbey. Isabelle stood before the engraved archway, wearing a soft ivory suit, no jewels, no pretense, only presence. A journalist asked, why this cause? Why now? And Isabelle, her voice quiet yet resolute, said, because I know what it's like to be written out of your own story. And I swore I would never let another girl grow up believing she didn't matter. Later that night, she stood alone on the rooftop garden of the foundation. The city lights stretched far into the horizon. Behind her, the old world crumbled. Before her, a future she had carved with her own hands. She opened a notebook, wrote one name across the first page in gold ink, Isabelle d'Orsay, hidden, not silent, but whole. She closed the notebook, smiled, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, she felt at peace, not because she had won, but because she had reclaimed her name, her story, her empire. They wrote her off as weak. She rewrote herself as inevitable. And now her name doesn't whisper, it thunders.